welcome to the after lunch session from this wonderful conference. There's a slight change in this one, not in the speakers, who have remained the same as they always were, in a manner of speaking. Microphone's not on.
It's on up here, yeah.
It says on. Maybe I'll just speak closer to it. How's that? Okay. But the title of this session is not going to be Catholic Feminism Creating a Culture of Life. That was an error. The title of this session is going to be Created Nature in a Broken World, a Call to Holiness. So at this point, I have been instructed to back off and say, and so if you don't want to be here for that particular session, feel free to leave. My speakers, however, are not allowed to leave. Okay, with the adjusted title. We are really fortunate today because both of the people talking today just bring a wealth of experience to this session. I'm going to introduce both of them now, give them the microphone, and then we'll hopefully have time for questions afterwards. But let me just briefly say something about each of them. Margaret Monahan Hogan, or Peg, is the chair of the philosophy department at King's College. She has her doctorate from Marquette University, an MA in philosophy from Fordham University, an AB in biology and chemistry from Immaculata College. She is an ethical consultant for Wyoming Valley Healthcare System, an ethical consultant for the Allied Health System, as well as an ethical consultant and resource faculty for the University of Notre Dame Medical Ethics Conference. Many of you come to that, so you're probably familiar with her from there if you haven't met her other places. She's also an ethical consultant for the Independent Review Board for the Diocese of Scranton. She was a visiting fellow last year, 2 years ago, I guess, visiting fellow at the University of Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, founding director of the King's College Center for Ethics and Public Life, member of the board of directors of the Center for Academic Integrity, as well as the wife of Dr. Thomas P. Hogan, provost and professor of psychology at the University of Scranton, and the mother of 6 children. And if that doesn't give you an inferiority complex, I don't know what would. So we are really delighted to have her here. She's just a wonderful person and a wonderful resource for this conference. Our other speaker is Laura Garcia, who is currently teaching at Boston College. She has taught prior to this at Rutgers University, at Georgetown University, and at the Catholic University of America. Her PhD is from Notre Dame here. And she has this huge list of publications that I am not going to read all of them, but they range from topics of St. John of the Cross to a personalist understanding of marriage to religious values and politics, just a wonderful range of issues. She doesn't limit herself to academic publications and presentations. The list of those is also very long. But she's also involved in general publications, discussions in the general press, radio interviews, discussions on pro-life feminism, one of the things she's very well known for, Pope John Paul II on women, the meaning of grace, Christian marriage, wonderful, wide-ranging papers and presentations on topics that, of course, are of central concern to living in culture today. So I would like to thank both of you very much for coming. We're excited to listen to you, and I will turn it over to you.
Because I don't want people outside to hear what I'm saying. It's just I think it'll be quieter in here. Laura and I are both feminists in the pro-life tradition, so I think maybe you will get a sense that feminists in the pro-life tradition have a particular way of looking at the world, and perhaps then there is some honesty in what David put in as our title. But nonetheless, from the very beginning, we both wanted to talk about created nature in a broken world and call to holiness, to recognize that the culture of death is a broken world, and we as broken beings struggle in this world. So my work today will be probably more reflective, and I think Laura's will be probably more practical. And you will hear some of the themes that you heard from Dr. McInerney last night. And I'm not upset about that, because I think there's a convergence that comes about when we understand what's going on. And then we can start to know how to respond to what's going on in the world. So let me turn directly to the paper. And by the way, thank you all for not leaving when we told you the title was different. Acknowledgement of our being as created in a broken world allows us a proper perspective to be in and to engage the world. Understanding our nature gives us direction, power, and limits to define and accomplish our flourishing and the flourishing of our culture. Acknowledgement of the brokenness of the world, the fact that it is wounded because we are wounded, provides us with a proper perspective on the precariousness and vulnerability of our position in the world. Understanding that we are creatures, and I think this is most evident to women, understanding that we are creatures permits us to have hope in this created and broken world. And the call to holiness, then, is a gift to us and a work for us. As I developed this theme this afternoon, I want to focus on two gifts. Originally, I wanted to focus on three, but Laura said she wanted to talk two. So I'm only going to focus on two gifts, which are ours to respond to the call to holiness. They are the gift of life and the gift of sexuality. I want to recognize at the same time that we hold these gifts in a culture that derides their value and impedes their flourishing. This culture is defined by a particular intellectual matrix within which there are powerful but erroneous claims that have caused it to be accurately named the culture of death. It is important to acknowledge these influences and to show their flaws, because they are disvalues which impede our response to the call to holiness. This particular intellectual matrix which defines our culture has established a particular worldview in which nature dissolves in the presence of radical egalitarianism and choice, and in which pleasure for the sake of pleasure is the controlling good. The matrix at its limit is given definition by a set of polar opposites. On one side, the claim is made that we are less than what we truly are, and on the other side, the claim is made that we are more than what we truly are. The former plunges us into despair, for it avers that the work of a lifetime dissolves with the disintegration and decay of the body. The latter elevates us to arrogance. It is rightly called hubris because it refuses to acknowledge the reality of the lengthy dependence of much of our young lives, and because it cannot bear to countenance the reality of the dependency and our dependency on others in our inevitable diminishment. The pole of despair lacks the understanding of our lives as gift of infinite love. The pole of arrogance fails to acknowledge our radical dependency of our lives on God, on the God who created us, the God who sustains us, and the God who relentlessly seeks us, this God whom we call this tremendous lover. No philosopher wrote more acutely of this despair than did Sartre, who spoke of the dread and anxiety and forlorn state of humanity, whom he described as condemned to be born into the world, condemned to be free, condemned to be among people in the world and to work among people in the world, and finally condemned to be finite in the world. The pole of arrogance is delineated by some of the philosophers of Western liberalism. It sees humanity as autonomous, rights-defining, rights-conferring, rights-bearing private individuals. It nurtures a bloated arrogance which pursues power at the same time that it claims that the pursuit of truth, especially the truth that would guide power rightly, is an exercise in futility. While each position contains part understanding of our position in the world, each is a fragment of our correct situation in the world, and the claim of completeness skews our culture. The pernicious influence of each bias left uncorrected fuels the decline of culture, as each disturbs the right order of culture. And if you were in Dr. Englehart's talk this morning, you heard that notion of the right order of culture. If culture is to progress, and that progression is by no means guaranteed, the correct understanding of what we are is essential, as is the freedom to act on that understanding. Only when we understand what we are will we be able to discern the end of life and set our lives in that direction. Only when we understand what we are will we be able to unsettle the contemporary culture and its disvalues. Only then will we penetrate that culture and heal it. And this is what the call to holiness requires of us. And only when we understand what we are will we be able to put into place the structures that facilitate our flourishing as individuals and as a people called to holiness. What is our position in the world? Contrary to the gloom cast by Sartre, we are in the world as gift. We are given life. We are given these bodies. We are given freedom and intelligence. We are given one another. We are given to one another. And we are given finitude, life as a particular gift in a particular time and in a particular place to be drawn to God. Let me turn to the first gift, life as a gift. The recognition of our own life as gift requires us to acknowledge not our autonomy, radical dependence for our existence, for our being sustained in our existence, and for our being drawn to God. Recognition of the gift of life requires us to recognize the gift of life of all human beings in that life itself. Recognition of life as a gift does not allow us to stand in judgment on the value of any human life, because it does not look like us, because it is so small, because of the possibility of its achievements are so limited, or because its cells would be so useful in caring for the diseases of others and in satisfying the imperatives of advancing research. To operate on feelings of sympathy and sadness, along with the desire to alleviate suffering, that is the reason for the feelings, without the rule of reason, is to unleash a terror first upon the vulnerable and ultimately upon the culture. This is wrongly named compassion when it calls for the destruction of the sympathy, of the subject of that sympathy. In a similar manner, the emotion of pride and the drive for power without the guidance of reason and its object truth is wrongly called courage and rightly called terrorism. Recognition of life as a gift recognizes its limitation in duration and power. This life will end, and in its end lies its fulfillment, a theme you heard from Dr. McInerney. These limited powers that we have will be made perfect. If recognition of the gift of life requires us to respect other lives, what does the recognition of the limits of life require us when we think about our own lives? First, it requires us to acknowledge and to embrace our finitude. We shall, each and every one of us, shall die. And in our dying, there is great suffering, both for us and for those we love. And in our death, the possibility of isolation is as real. To deny this fact is to deny the reality of our situation in the world. Even the incarnate God experienced suffering and isolation and prayed for relief. In his suffering and in his dying, Jesus, from the depths of his humanity, called out for consolation. In Gethsemane, he asked to be rescued. He revealed to his friends his grief and anguish, and he asked them to stay with him. And he was sorely disappointed by their failure to remain. He experienced abandonment, and at the end he cried out to his Father to rescue him. And at last he placed himself in his Father's care to be received by his Father. This journey will be ours. While the expectation of limited duration and the anticipation of joy in union with God may, on a cognitive level, mitigate its sting, the sting must be endured. This final enduring is our last opportunity to reach out to the power of God, to affirm once and for all our radical dependence on God. The grasp of this truth by each one of us for our own lives requires us to walk the path between viewing death as the greatest of evils and viewing death as the greatest of all goods. The grasp of this truth requires us to hold simultaneously grief and joy, too difficult a task for a broken creature on her own. The consequence of this truth calls us to be both active and passive, to be in a particular way and to do particular sorts of things. The passivity relates to our own dying, and the activity relates to the services that we render to others in their dying. In our dying, we must be prepared to submit in our dependence on each other and to God. No one wrote more clearly of this nor lived this more fully than did Father Richard McCormick, a giant of a man whose works I'm sure you're familiar, and a giant of a moral theologian. In his words and in his living to the very end of his life, he frequently reminded us that dependency, whether from age or illness, is a call to cling to the power of God. He cautioned us that the press for physician-assisted suicide is at once an act of isolation and abandonment. It is a rejection of our dependence, which ultimately means a rejection of our interdependence and eventually of our very mortality. In the presence of dying others, we must affirm our interdependence as we provide services and places within which human beings who are experiencing, as did Jesus, crushing sorrow, anguish, and abandonment, will receive care from loving people who will wash and touch and anoint their bodies, and who will, at the end, by their very presence, sustain in the hope of those whose journey to God is in its final stages. And for their part, the dying, and we who will die, have one last lesson to teach the world. What we need to teach is we need to teach patience in our dying. And in our dying, as we are patient, we will imitate God who is patient. God who endured the cross and God who endures us. Stanley Hauerwas suggests that if we as Christians could be patient patients, we might have a witness to our non-Christian neighbor. This is the call to holiness that Professor Engelhardt talked about this morning. And in that witness lies the power to transform culture. The second gift that I want to talk about is the gift of sexuality. The gift of life is the gift of a particular kind of life. It is embodied, and its embodiment is sexual. We are in this world as women and men, and as women and men, we are drawn to one another in particular ways, because we are physical, emotional, passionate, rational, and spiritual beings. We are drawn to each other, and we strive for each other physically, emotionally, passionately, rationally, and spiritually. For most of us, the gift of sex is accompanied by the gift of marriage, the gift of being in the world as men and women, and the gift of marriage set limits and define ends for human flourishing in marriage. So it's not like when you get married you throw the book away. No, when you get married you get a different book. Marriage has a nature. Marriage is a lifelong heterosexual union between one man and one woman within which certain ends are to be accomplished. Marriage has a sign which signifies marriage, and marriage has a sign which signifies and contains the reality of marriage. The sign which signifies marriage is the faithful union of Christ and the Church. The sign, though, which signifies and contains the reality of marriage is the act of sexual intercourse. It is conjugal intercourse. For the sake of the flourishing of men and women, and for the sake of the flourishing of children, for the sake of the flourishing of society, sexual intercourse is reserved to marriage. Here it serves as at once, the individual human good of a particular man and a particular woman, and the good of their union. In this act lies the possibility of the gift of children, and the possibility of this great gift requires responsibility in the exercise of that act. For it is not just the existence of children, but their flourishing as rational beings, and their flourishing as God's children, destined to union with God, that is the struggle of men and women who would be parents in the vocation of marriage. The gift of pleasure that is found in conjugal intercourse is not just its exquisite sensual pleasure, that is there, but that pleasure, as it disposes husband and wife toward the progression in friendship, and then to love of each other, that love of each other that is promised to be realized by men and women in the joy of marriage, but ultimately to allow them the experience of the ultimate joy of union with God. In the work of Thomas Aquinas, there is much wisdom on the nature of marriage, and I want to plumb some of that wisdom today because I want to apply it to some of the particular problems that are vexing us in this contemporary moment in regard to marriage. Thomas Aquinas has wrote on marriage in the commentary on Book 4 in the Sentences, which is entitled The Supplement to the Theologiae most frequently, and in the third book of the Summa Contra Gentiles. In these synthetic counts, which are built on elements found in Aristotle, the Scriptures, and Augustine, Aquinas offers, in addition to the description of marriage as an institution for offspring and the remediation of concupiscence, observation of marriage as a natural relationship, a union between a man and a woman. This relationship, he says, a tie between a man and a woman, results from the combination of the action of free will and the natural inclination of men and women to each other. In addition to the explicit description of marriage as essentially a heterosexual union, Thomas designates two ends to be accomplished within marriage. They are the principal end, offspring, and the secondary end, the mutual service which married persons render to one another. In the distinction 27 of Book 4, he develops this notion of the kind of joining that is appropriate for marriage, and he talks about it as this joining between two lawful persons, between one man and one woman, and he talks about the force of the joining. He indicates that this force of the joining is so great that it is indissoluble. And this is very important to focus on, this kind of joining that he talks about, that is marriage. In his characterization of the kind of joining that constitutes the union that is marriage, Thomas describes marriage in two ways, one as a unity of purpose and the other as a unity of being. I will focus much more on the unity in being than on the unity of purpose. There's a great deal that has been written on the unity of purpose in marriage, but not quite as much written on the unity in being. And I think a refocusing which includes the unity in being helps us with some of the problems that are vexing us today. He says, in regard to a joining of purpose, by marriage, certain persons are directed to one begetting and upbringing of children, and again to one family life in respect of which we speak of husband and wife. In regard to the joining in being, he speaks about the bond. And he says the bond between the spouses is the reality contained in marriage. The bond between husband and wife resulting from these acts is reality and sacrament. The ultimate reality contained is the effect of the sacrament, while the non-contained reality is the sign of Christ and his church. Moreover, Thomas notes the physical and spiritual aspects of the union which contribute to its constitution as a personal union when he says the joining together is a joining of bodies and minds as a result of matrimony. And again, in describing the marital union, he says, for the joining of husband and wife by matrimony is the greatest of all joinings, since it is a joining of soul and body, hence it is called a conjugal union. Because marriage is in its essence a joining together, Thomas maintains that reference to marriage as a conjugal union is appropriate. Furthermore, in the consideration of marriage as a relation, Thomas maintains that every relation has a unity in the cause of the relation and a diversity inasmuch as the subjects that are related in terms of the causes are diverse subjects. Now, inasmuch as marriage has a unity of purpose and a unity in being, it has a cause that relates the diverse subjects in the unity of person, and a cause that relates the subjects in the unity in being. In regard to the unity of purpose, the cause that relates the subjects is procreation, and the diverse subjects are man and woman as potential parents. In regard to the unity in being, the cause that relates the subjects is the marriage bond. The diverse subjects are man as inclined to woman and woman as inclined to man. The marriage bond is what is being caused. As a reality in the objective order, then, marriage is an entity constituted in the real relation of subject to subject. The relation, as a union, is established as a nexus or connection between two persons who are in their very nature mutually ordered to each other. The spouses, as the principles of the relationship, are those whose to be those who's to be, precisely as spouses, is to be ordered to each other. Each acts in each other, each is acted upon the other. The spouses are related as the complementary principles of the new, which is the marriage. The marriage is a being in and of itself. The marriage, then, reified as the marriage bond, is the appropriate juridical entity in canon law. It has privileged standing in the legal order. So, too, the marriage bond itself is the moral entity in the ethical order. This understanding of the nature of marriage sets up a framework for explicating some vexing issues in our contemporary culture. Within this understanding of marriage, the rudiments of a response to the pressing question of the possibility of homosexual marriage lies, as well as the rudiments to responses of other pressing issues. Now, as a starting point, whatever the relationship between members of the same sex might be, it is not marriage. Marriage is a union, physical, emotional, and spiritual, formed between one man and one woman. The union of sexually differentiated persons, differentiated as male and female, instantiates ontological completeness. It is a unity in being as well as a unity of purpose. The unity in being, which is the marriage, can only be constituted by one man and one woman. Marriage requires the complementarity of two specific kinds of persons who, in their very nature, are mutually ordered to each other. Marriage is a unity on the level of essence. While other types of complementarity may be possible among human beings as types of moral unions or unions of activity or purpose, the very nature of marriage, its to be, requires a particular kind of complementarity to form its unique kind of union. This new reality, the marriage, lasts as long as the partners live. This union provides a loving matrix for the generation and nurturing of children, and this union provides the intimate, stable relationship of the appropriate satisfaction of sexual pleasure. The possibility of forming a particular kind of physical union, the possibility of forming a particular kind of physical union, as well as a particular type of rational and spiritual union, is required for marriage regardless of whether or not the physical union is ever actualized. Human life is embodied, the body counts. The sexual organs of man and woman are apt to form, to complete, a particular type of union. A homosexual relationship cannot be a union as a physical union in the manner in which marriage is a physical union. Physical contact and material contiguity are not sufficient to form this type of union. It is impossible for the sexual organs of two men together or two women together to constitute the particular physical union, the possibility of which is required for marriage. Furthermore, it is impossible for two men together or for two women together to form the particular kind of rational and spiritual union required for marriage. Now, there are at least three objections to the position developed here. One objection maintains that the claims regarding the nature of marriage as a lifelong heterosexual union are simply claims embedded within a particular tradition. The second objection is that marriage is simply a social construct fashioned by the will of autonomous human beings to enhance their flourishing. And the third objection converges around a set of ideas that, A, there exist a variety of sexual manifestations in male and female, and B, there exists many different kinds of complementarity between human beings. The sexual complementarity of male and female is just one instance of possible complementarity. And C, other complementarities must be recognized and other types of unions must be acknowledged. And D, where unity of purpose is accompanied by commitment and would be enhanced by sexual intimacy, it should be permitted. Let me address these objections. In regard to the first objection, as a lifelong heterosexual union is a traditional claim, but that does not mean that marriage thus understood cannot be correct, or that marriage thus understood has no place outside a particular tradition. This understanding of the nature of marriage is affirmed in many traditions and has been affirmed over time. Its test as a correct understanding is whether or not marriage thus understood and lived contributes to integral human flourishing. both for individuals and society? The answers to this test are to be found in the concrete data of human living. While insight into that data may be encumbered by the necessity of longevity of the study and the possibility of bias in the observer, there does seem to be ongoing, recurrent, and widespread affirmation of the essential role of marriage, thus understood as the hinge institution to the flourishing of both individuals and society. Is it not a key sign for the validity of the tradition, its capacity to facilitate human flourishing? To this point in time, such evidence in regard to homosexual unions is lacking. The characterization of male homosexual relationships as self-centered, transitory, and promiscuous appears to be more than anecdotal. While evidence seems to be lacking for the existence of committed, exclusive, lifelong homosexual unions, the lack of evidence may have its source in the perhaps understandable failure of those who live these relationships to come forward and testify to their value. And I recognize that at this moment, historically, it would be very difficult for them to do that. On the other hand, there may be no such evidence. So again, that waits the test of time. In regard to the second objection, marriage is not a social construct. Marriage has a nature that is both real and rational. Marriage has essential properties which are manifested over time in the being and the becoming of marriage. In the delineation of the essential properties of marriage, human reason confronts an existing reality, insight into whose nature may be gained more or less completely, but whose nature cannot be deconstructed and recreated by wish. Human beings are free to enter into marriage or not, but human beings are not free to decide the nature of marriage. What is required for the study of the essential nature of marriage is an adequate epistemology, which is capable of accomplishing a more complete metaphysics, which guides the formulation of a proper ethics. Insight into the nature of marriage, just like insight into the nature of anything else, requires time and study. It makes no difference whether it is something in the physical world or something in the moral world. Reason raises the question, what is it? This initiates inquiry, and the question, is it so, demands verification, and we ought not to rest until verification is accomplished. We need to continue and continuously do that in regard to marriage. In regard to the third objection, there may be occurrences of sexual differentiation other than male and female, but these have appearance of aberration and disorder. Second, there are manifestations of different kinds of human complementarities. However, these complementarities themselves have to be assessed and have to be actualized in appropriate unions which are suitable for human flourishing. Complementarities in music bring forth the symphony. Complementarities in human learning. Complementarities in athletic skills spawn basketball teams, football teams. On the other hand, a different set of complementarities spawn fascism, another communism, and another still, a gang intent on robbing a bank. The former set of complementarities are normally valued as order to human flourishing and assessed as good. The latter set of complementarities are normally valued as disordered and assessed as evil. The linkage claimed between the enhancement of committed sexual relationships and sexual intimacy has neither been established nor have defensible relationships been defined. Furthermore, when sexual intimacy becomes considered simply a more intense form of affection, limited to those in a special committed relationship, it becomes difficult to sustain defensible prohibitions of either intense affection and other important relationships such as student-teacher, physician-patient, trainer-athlete, parent-child, priest-communicant. Am I done? Is that it?
Yep.
Or did I mark it? Okay.
Okay, thanks. For those of you at the back, there are just a few seats up in the front. If people want to sit down just a moment, and we will turn it over to Laura.
I'd like to continue in this paper a subject I took up last year at this conference. It was on the topic of sex, and I found I really liked that topic, and so I wanted to extend it again in this talk. And last time talked mainly about three different models of sexuality and contrasting them with the view that one finds in the Christian tradition, and especially more recently in the writings of the Holy Father, John Paul II. And this time I want to focus, I guess, more on that last model, trying to develop and expand it a bit. So I'm calling this Christians and the Joys of Sex. It may seem to some that any discussion of Christians and the joys of sex is bound to be a short one. After all, Christianity is a leading source of restrictions and prohibitions in the sexual arena, and has been known to issue dire warnings about the dangers of the sexual appetites and impassioned recommendations of the celibate life over marriage. Secular culture sees itself, by contrast, as the great liberator of the libido, casting off outdated taboos and giving its blessing to any and all forms of sexual expression. Only the prohibition against causing pain, or at least unwanted pain, remains untouched. In this brave new sexual world, nearly everything is permitted. The promise is that this freedom of sexual expression will promote better relationships because more honest and open, fewer hassles because of universal access to contraception and abortion, and a lot more pleasure all the way around. But this is reality. In practice, removing the special status of sex and watching its accompanying moral constraints unravel has not produced anything like a utopian society. As we all learn at a young age, even if everything were permitted, not everything would serve our genuine good. Some actions ennoble and edify, others degrade and destroy. If sex is a meaningless or trivial activity, all our sexual relationships will be meaningless and trivial too. Perhaps some bought into the sexual smorgasbord mentality because they had in the back of their minds something like the following false dichotomy. Either sexual pleasure is always a good, or such pleasure is inherently bad. It can't be inherently bad. This much seems right, at least. Therefore, it is always a good. What slides into this handy syllogism is the unwarranted assumption that pleasure itself is good. Virtually any means one uses to achieve it is also a good. Clearly, distinctions are in order here, but it's not in the interest of either the entertainment world or the advertising industry to make them. It's not controversial, I think, to point out that our culture's current contempt for human life is aided and abetted by a profound confusion about sex. Indeed, a contempt for the understanding of sex that was informed in many ways by Christianity and which is so ably explicated by Peg. The time has come for Christians and others of like persuasion to offer our culture a course on sex education. The topics of such a course will not be the many types of contraceptives or the even more baroque varieties of STDs or Viagra or practical tips for power lovers. Rather, they will focus on the meaning of sex. If we can recapture something of what we have lost sight of in this department, the culture of life will be the first to benefit. Women and children will be primary beneficiaries as well, I think, but that's a topic for another time. The connection between actions and the pleasures that accompany them was discussed at least as early as Aristotle, and in this, as in many other things, one can learn a great deal from him. Aristotle argues that pleasure cannot be the chief end of human life, in part because we do not aim simply at pleasure itself. Pleasure accompanies various things we do, and the pleasure is intrinsic to those activities, so that one finds pleasure in them, but pleasure isn't an independent outcome that can be separated from the activities themselves. What we seek, says Aristotle, is not primarily the pleasurable sensation alone, but the pleasure of tea. Further, he argues that virtuous persons experience the greatest pleasures. Virtuous actions are genuinely productive of our good, and those who have acquired the virtues take pleasure in exercising them. One might also find pleasure in vicious activities, of course, but it would not be the same pleasure. In fact, it would be inferior in many ways, he thinks, not as lasting, more mixed with pain, unstable, and so on. In addition to this Aristotelian connection between activities and pleasures, might do well to contemplate the recent treatment of actions and their significance in the writings of Karl Wojtyla, both before and after he became Pope John Paul II. This theology of the body, as it's come to be called, is a rich source of reflection on the nature of the human person and covers ground far outside the normal boundaries of theology. For our purposes, I wish to mention just three insights. One, actions reveal the person. Actions reveal the person. Because they are chosen freely and deliberately, they tell us much about the personality and character of the agent. The body is always the medium of communication with other persons. Second, bodily actions form the basis of verbal forms of communication. They are prior to and more fundamental than words. And there is a universality in them. In every culture, we can understand when someone's drawing attention to an object, say, by pointing to it or holding it up. We readily interpret the meaning of many facial expressions, especially smiles and frowns, as well as the import of various gestures or touches. It's impossible to imagine teaching someone a language, in fact, without the use of gestures. 3, for some actions, their meaning is inseparable from them. Their meaning is inseparable from them. They have a specific natural significance which attaches to them by a kind of physical necessity. We cannot alter that significance or that message, since we are not its authors, but we can confirm the message internally in our intentions and will, or we can internally reject it or try to distance ourselves from it. When we internally reject that natural meaning, we could be said to lie by our actions. We convey a message by our outward bodily actions that we repudiate in our hearts. Examples of such behavior abound. One thinks of the pain caused by an insincere smile or handshake, or of the surprise when a gesture of peace. Then there is the memorable scene in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus asks, "Judas, do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" One of the more chilling moments in recent cinema occurs in a conversation between Cameron Diaz and Tom Cruise during a harrowing car ride in the movie Vanilla Sky. Cameron Diaz is at the wheel, but she is clearly on a psychological edge, and her tone and her erratic driving reflect this. When Cruise tries to calm her down, she will hear nothing of it. In a dramatic and passionate speech, she fires at him, "When you sleep with someone, your body makes a promise, even if you don't." Since it seems unlikely that the screenwriter was reading papal homilies, I offer this as independent evidence for the view that sex does in fact have intrinsic meaning. Of course, the character who voices this opinion turns out to be insane, but that needn't cancel out the wisdom of her insight on this point. Many ex-lovers have felt betrayed and deceived in the same way, though not everyone seeks the same sort of revenge. Right, following Aristotle and John Paul II, then, we note that sexual intercourse involves bodily actions that are A, accompanied by a pleasure intrinsic to them, and B, naturally interpreted as conveying a specific message. More needs to be said about this natural meaning of sex. What does this kind of bodily union convey? If it's not entered into voluntarily, of course it conveys nothing. It's not a genuine action. But when it is freely chosen, the sexual act expresses a love which is total and unconditional. One entrusts oneself wholly to the beloved, and one is wholly entrusted with him or her. That complimentary way of putting it, emphasizing, I owe to Rebecca Canonda, who was put it up last time, I think, that we have to focus on both those, giving ourselves completely, but also receiving the other in a kind of unconditional way. The physical union has both an external and an internal dimension. As John Paul II puts it, sex forms a union that is also a communion. The gift of one's body is a gift of oneself as well, a gift and a promise. That intense pleasure accompanies sex is a natural part of these actions. Hence, Christian theologians, and indeed most theistic philosophers, teach that sexual pleasure is willed by God in creating the human body, and that it is a good. In fact, it's both a result and a cause of the deeply personal union of which it is a part, so that the pleasure of sex should be welcomed and celebrated. John Paul II has even endorsed mutual orgasm as a goal to strive for in marital lovemaking. St. Thomas insists that sex was accompanied by pleasure, even in the state of original innocence. In fact, he says the pleasure was even greater than, quote, in proportion to the greater purity of nature and the greater sensibility of the body. Further, this pleasure was unmixed with any fear or self-consciousness. As the book of Genesis has it, Adam and Eve were naked and were not ashamed. They had nothing to hide from each other. It's true that the Christian tradition, indeed the philosophical tradition, teaches that reason must play a role in these actions, as in all deliberate human actions. But reason's role, says Thomas, is not to lessen the pleasure of sex, but to keep the passions and will from seeking that pleasure in a disproportionate way, ignoring the other ends and dimensions of the action. Sexual pleasure, then, can be wholly good and virtuous, and is so considered in itself. This in spite of the fact that in sexual activity, reason is frequently overwhelmed by the abundance of pleasure, as Aristotle puts it. As long as an act is in accordance with right reason, It need not be directed at every moment by reason. St. Thomas notes that if this were a requirement, it would be immoral to go to sleep at night. That the Christian understanding of sexual pleasure is one of affirmation has been little understood or appreciated in contemporary thought, however. In a recent paper on Iris Murdoch and the themes of erotic love, Martha Nussbaum, a philosopher at the University of Chicago, contrasts Plato's eros-affirming view with what she takes to be Dante's anti-eros view. She ascribes to Dante the view that sexual love is a sin that, like other sins, quote, impedes the vision of the reality of the other, unquote. For Nussbaum's Dante, quoting her, love must be purified of bodily desire before true vision of the other person or of the good can be achieved. Nussbaum suggests then that Dante makes no distinction between sexual desire and lust or concupiscence. I have doubts about this reading of Dante, but surely the truth of the matter is that these can and should be distinguished. In our fallen and troubled condition, no doubt there is a tendency for our desires to get out of hand and to obscure our vision of the other. But this does not mean they cannot be taken up into a love that both delights in the beloved and offers to him or her all that one has. To St. Thomas' positive assessment of sexual pleasure, we can add two further notes: personalism of John Paul II and the sacramental dimension of marital love, which is mentioned by Peg Hogan. As for personalism, although I will not argue for it here, a strong case can be made for the Kantian insight that persons should be treated as ends in themselves, never as means to an end. Or, as John Paul II likes to put it, the only proper response to a person is love. Combine this with some obvious facts about the human body: that we govern our own actions, that they generally indicate our intentions, that our bodies are male or female, and hence correspond to one another or complete one another, that attraction between the sexes is natural, that sexual union is accompanied with profound pleasure, actually linked with procreation. Sex is the arena in which new life comes to be, the life not simply of another person, but of a person who literally incarnates the union of man and the woman, increasing their joy and the bond between them, enriching their lives with a further profound connection to a person. Drawing on all of these features of the human body and the human condition, John II notes that the gift of one's body in sexual union conveys or communicates a gift of the whole person. One's body is the medium of this gift, but it includes one's mind and heart as well. It's a physical union so intimate that it requires of each person a total entrusting of self to the other and a total acceptance of the other's trust. In emphasizing the totality of this gift of self, the Pope draws on features of the inner life of persons as well as on the more external biological factors already mentioned. He agrees with Aristotle that we are made for happiness and that we cannot help seeking it. But he adds that for human persons, happiness is found in loving and in being loved. What we naturally want to say to another person and what we naturally want to hear is, I am yours alone and you are mine. I will love you and cherish you all the days of my life. Nothing will be able to separate us. The natural connection between sex and procreation is perhaps the most fundamental element in the meaning of sex. Right? St. Thomas, as we saw, calls it the primary significance, primary meaning. Even when it is deliberately ignored or set aside, it cannot be removed from that message. In a sense, then, casual sex is an oxymoron. Sex cannot be made into something purely casual. In its potential for new life, sex projects us into the future. It says, among other things, that this person is someone with whom one would have children, and children are the commitment of a lifetime. Those of you who have adult children know this very well. There'll never be a time when your children are simply on their own, much as we might hope and desire that. Okay? Mine aren't here, so I can say that. One of the obvious that sex plays in society is to continue the life of the community. As John Paul II puts it in his play, The Jeweler's Shop, the rings that a couple exchange in the marriage ceremony join the past to the future. Sex is the source of all the deepest ties that bind us to one another. When this fundamental dimension of sex is deliberately frustrated or rejected in some way, the message conveyed by the sexual act gets distorted as well. Though the Christian community is currently divided over the moral permissibility of contraception, it might be worthwhile reflecting on this question. To what extent has the contraceptive imperative we've been hearing for decades from Planned Parenthood contribute to the increasing trivialization of sex in our culture? Contraceptives Act, as so many have ably argued, introduces a partial rejection of one's lover and a partial withholding of oneself. One gives everything except one's fertility, one's potential motherhood, and one receives the other except for his or her potential fatherhood or motherhood. The deliberate sterilization of the Marriage Act means that it no longer projects the relationship into the future in the same way. It can begin to seem more the promise of a moment than the promise of a lifetime. Removing the potential for new life also means that in this act, at least, one does not accept the partner as a potential mother or father of one's children. The stakes are lowered. And of course, this is supposed to be freeing for the couple. No worries about pregnancy to intrude on the pleasures of sex for the time being. The difficulty is that in acts of this kind, one's partner becomes, in principle, replaceable by someone else, possibly even by something else. Why not multiple partners, or at least serial partners? Contraception interferes with the sense married people have that for as long as they live, no one else can take their place in the life of their beloved. On the other hand, as theologian William May argues, sex that is free from contraceptive interference naturally conveys that one's beloved is, as he puts it, unique and non-substitutable in one's life. Probably that phrase is not going to catch on as a song lyric, but although maybe a rap song. You're so beautiful, non-substitutable. Something like that. Okay. I haven't worked it out, but...
Obviously.
Thanks, please don't try. Stick to philosophy. Okay. Right. Openness to children creates a certain atmosphere or ambience for sexual activity. It urges love to grow and the heart to expand. It keeps before each party's awareness the many dimensions, the richness of the beloved. It's a trust of perhaps the deepest kind. Not only I trust of my body and my happiness, but also I trust you with the happiness of my children. My contention is that knowing one is trusted in this way is deeply satisfying. Sexual activity, affirmed in all of its meanings, is indeed accompanied by great pleasure, even by joy. We need not deny that concerns about one's capacity to properly welcome and provide for a new child can at times interfere with the pleasure and spontaneity of sex, although there is Aristotle's point that such rational calculations tend to fade during sex itself, anyway. But there are natural methods of family planning that one can turn to in such circumstances while leaving the meaning of sexuality itself wholly in place. The fear factor, to the extent that it is a problem for a couple, can also be an occasion for fruitful reflection and conversation about the value of children in comparison with other values and the possibilities of leaving the future more open to God's providence. A common response to the view I've been promoting here, that there are some moral objections to contraceptive sex, takes this form. Within a marriage relationship, at least, there's no need for sex to be open to procreation in every instance. This suffices for preserving this connection if sex is sometimes open to procreation, or if the couple isn't opposed in principle to having children. And I believe this does indicate a significant, even a seismic difference between sex in marriage and sex outside of it. Of course, very important. However, I think the reasoning here is not wholly adequate, and so in response I offer these considerations. Since a couple's desire to have another child will likely be less frequent than their desire to make love, just guessing, the vast majority of sexual acts within a contracepting couple's married life will be acts that are deliberately sterilized in some form or another. This blunts the capacity of these actions to convey the deeper meaning that they would naturally convey, even in marriage, where children are anticipated at some point. Each of our acts has meaning, just as each of our words has meaning. And when on any occasion we say one thing with our bodies while denying it in our minds, we do an injustice to the truth and to the other person. This is not to say that all such acts are going to be morally blameworthy. Of course, certainly our culture's ability to appreciate these considerations I'm offering here has been deeply blunted by decades of loud pronunciations on the other side, or sometimes by an even louder silence, even in our own churches, Catholic or Protestant. To take a more empirical, then maybe objective approach for a moment, we must remember that the rationale for legalizing use of contraceptives in the courts was eventually extended by them to strike down laws against premarital sex and sodomy. The promise of so-called reproductive control and the unrestricted exercise of sexual desires came to seem a fundamental human right. That the Supreme Court's decision to overturn laws against abortion appealed to some of those earlier decisions, with their language of privacy and entitlement, might be more than coincidental. Having handed over the keys to the gate of life, as it were, it became harder to resist surrendering the keys of death. As one further indication of the connections among these issues, consider a book published in 2000 by Midas Deckers, bearing the provocative title, Dearest Pet, on Bestiality. You didn't know what you're in for, did you? You had your chance to go. Nerve magazine, you can access that at nerve.com, by the way, just for fun. Nerve magazine in April of 2001 published a review of this book written by philosopher Peter Singer of Princeton University, a veritable high priest of the culture of death. Singer opens with this observation. Not so long ago, he says, any form of sexuality not leading to the conception of children was seen as, at best, wanton lust, or worse, a perversion. Parenthetically, this misrepresents a tradition which, as we have seen, does not require that sex lead to procreation, only that it remain open to it. But we go on. The idea that it could be wrong to use contraception in order to separate sex from reproduction is now merely quaint. If some religions still teach that masturbation is self-abuse, that just shows how out of touch they have become. Sodomy, that's all part of the joy of sex, recommended for couples seeking erotic variety. Unquote. Singer goes on to celebrate the fact that the sexual preferences of gays and lesbians are growing more accepted day by day, and during President Clinton's Monica days, says Singer, quote, no one dared suggest that he was unfit to be president just because he had taken part in a sexual activity that was, in many jurisdictions, a crime. As I recall, some did dare to suggest this, but maybe they're not people that Peter Singer talks to. Singer clearly rejoices in the mentality that treats masturbation, even sodomy, as no big deal. After all, the main objection to them was simply from procreation. But then one has to wonder why the big taboo against sex with animals. As Decker's book illustrates in unpleasant detail, according to Singer, I found this book wasn't in our library. I've got to say, I wasn't not unpleased to find that, but it's not as though people aren't doing it. The reason they don't yet talk about it at dinner parties, says Singer, is not that it's in some way intrinsically problematic, but that, quote, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we've always seen ourselves as distinct from animals, and imagined that a wide, unbridgeable gulf separates us from them. Humans alone are made in the image of God. Only human beings have an immortal soul. Okay, you can hear the sarcasm. Singer admits the existence of a few non-theological defenses of a unique place for human beings, with Immanuel Kant serving as Exhibit A. Alas, according to Singer, this tradition just misses the mark. We're not particularly different from the other animals, and sex is one area that makes the similarities most obvious. Human sex organs are similar enough to those of other mammals that apparently it's possible, for men anyway, to experience sexual satisfaction with a calf, a sheep, or even a hen. Though this doesn't turn out that well for the hen, it seems. Lack of consent can only be a problem, perhaps, where such consent is possible to give. It's not as though the animals clearly object, and we do sometimes even kill them against their presumed wishes. In any event, where sex with animals doesn't involve cruelty to them, Singer thinks there can be no moral objection to it. Presumably, he expects his readers to agree with him about the quaintness of thinking human beings are special in some way. Quote, we are animals, he concludes. Indeed, more specifically, we are great apes. This does not make sex across the species normal or natural, whatever those much misused words may mean, but it does imply that it ceases to be an offense to our status and dignity as human beings. This may motivate some to remove those bumper stickers proclaiming, I love my poodle. Wives used to worry only about Fifi LaRue. Now it might be Fluffy, too. The key to Singer's position is sounded, though, in the opening line of his review, where he strongly endorses the sundering, or at least an intent, of any important connection between sex and children. This, in turn, leads him into a kind of consistent ethic of perversion, which is chillingly effective in its even-handed application of the anti-dignity principle. One of the implications of treating bestiality as just another sexual preference is that it obscures what's morally wrong with using a human being as a means to an end, such as the end of sexual satisfaction. Animals normally don't ask permission from their sexual partners, and there's not even a possibility that these acts express some level of affection. In fact, they express exactly nothing. If we are mere animals, there's no reason why we should expect our sex acts to have any personal significance either. During the sexual revolution of the 1960s, at least there was some mention of love in slogans like free love or make love, not war. Today's teens and 20-somethings rarely describe sex in terms of love. It's simply hooking up or getting busy or having friends with privileges. Right? If sex without strings leads to human happiness, then these young people should be ecstatic. But as anyone knows who spends time on a high school or college campus, this way of life has a deeply corrosive effect on the hearts and lives of young men and women. Meaningless sex provides less and less, even by way of sexual pleasure, and the participants find their sense of personal dignity shrinking to the point of nothingness. It's the triumph of Singer's anti-humanism. As an antidote to his depiction of sex and human relationships, let us instead operate from the assumption that the personal is precisely what distinguishes humans from the other animals, in sex as in every other activity. The organs may be similar, but the actions never can be, because persons choose to give themselves to one another. They're not coerced by instincts or desires. Assuming further that Kant is right in holding persons must always be treated as ends, the mutual experience of sexual pleasure cannot be the end to which a person is the means. Rather, the person is the end. Human coupling takes place under a conscious awareness of the two of us as potential parents of a child whose coming into being would change us forever. We would all our lives, and even in eternity, be the mother and father of this child. It's because we do know this at some level that sex can still provoke in us feelings of wonder and awe. In one of his most read essays, C.S. Lewis speaks eloquently of the special significance of human beings. Yes, in part because they are destined for immortality and splendor. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, he says, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you can talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship. Our friendships and our loves, says Lewis, should be conducted with the reverence proper to the beings that we are. When John Paul II takes up the theme of the appropriate response to persons, he often phrases it in terms of the way in which we look at others. Human persons are to be seen with the heart. That is, we must see beyond the outward beauty and attraction of the human being into the greatness, the glory written into their souls. He writes, we need to foster in ourselves and in others a contemplative outlook. It is the outlook of those who do not presume to take possession of reality, but instead accept it as a gift, discovering in all things the reflection of the Creator and seeing in every person his living image. It's time for all of us, with deep religious awe, to rediscover the ability to revere and honor every person. If persons are meant to be seen with the heart, we may assume they are also meant to be touched with the heart. All of our actions should be informed by love and respect for those who receive them, by sensitivity to their needs and vulnerabilities. John Paul II reminds us that in the life of a married couple, the vows made on their wedding day are sealed by their lovemaking, and their lovemaking is always to be repeated in their minds and hearts. Married life is meant to echo and re-echo, in good times and bad, in sickness and in health, in words and in deeds. I am yours, and you are mine. It's time to conclude. Much could be added here about the meaning and implications of marriage as a sacrament, or a great mystery, as St. Paul calls it. In New Testament theology, marriage is an icon of the love of Christ for the church. If in marriage, then, the body is so central to the personal union, we can only suppose that the body is similarly included in that fuller union with Christ that awaits us in heaven. In his meditation on what role physical pleasures might have in the next life, C.S. Lewis asks, what would it be to taste at the fountainhead, that stream of which even these lower reaches prove so intoxicating? Seen from this perspective, sexual pleasure, even at its most intense, is merely a shadow, a sort of beginner's course in beatitude. We are not strong enough to bear it now, but one day, perhaps, in our glorified bodies, we'll be able to experience the deeper meaning of the psalmist's words, in your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand there are pleasures forevermore.
both of our speakers, and since they both kept it right on time, we have time for questions. So I see one right now. They're going to field their own, so if you would direct the questions to them.
This is really common on most papers, which are just really models of clarity and kind of mapping the world out in front of us. I thank both of you. These comments may be these may not be unknown research, but I recommend them to strengthen everything that you said. And first on the issue of complementarity, there's a lot of evidence in the neurosciences concerning the male brain and female brain that you really don't have a human brain until you have a male brain and a female brain in companionship. And the evidence here is very striking. For example, females excel in hearing. The female brain excels at hearing. The male brain excels at seeing. So you have a completion of the brain when you have the male and the female together. And there are many other examples concerning these excellences that each brain realizes. So on that issue of complementarity, it seems that there's a lot of neurological evidence for the claim that you're making, and I think just would go ground a lot of that. On the issue of the Carmen Diaz quote, which is very memorable, the hormonal evidence, the evidence concerning hormones bear out that claim, that actually the body does, for example, the hormone oxytocin in sexual relations is typically released. It does commit the sexual partners to one another, not specifically. And there are corresponding hormones concerning providing that are released, that bear upon male activity concerning providing for she with whom sexual intercourse has occurred, and for offspring, things like that. So there's a lot of empirical stuff out there that really complements these claims.
Tom, I think that part about that's found in Thomas Aquinas and not really developed is a very important part, that notion that we have now unity in being. And we've really not focused on that. Most of the development of the tradition has been on the unity of purpose, that of creating children. And I think that whole concept of unity in being, this essential unity in which the two are parts, elements of, I think we need to go and develop that part much more fully than we have in the tradition. It's a very, very rich part. And I do think it's complemented in a lot of other places. The study, I think, will find complementarity in many places.
One book I would recommend is just...
Hang on, can I open the floor to other questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? Way in the back.
Other than the complementarity between the sex organs and brains in heterosexual relations, what is really the essential difference between, as you define it, between sexual relations in a committed homosexual relationship and sexual relations in a heterosexual marriage in which infertility is intentionally chosen and perhaps permanent, as in the case of surgical sterilization?
That's. I guess I'm going to stand up. This was really where we ended the conference last year, our session on the conference, and that's one of the reasons I went back and developed this notion of ontological completeness, this notion of union in being, not just union in purpose. So I think what you're describing is a situation where this particular purpose, that is the purpose of generating offspring, is no longer possible. And I'd have to say, okay, I give you that, that in a homosexual relationship you're not going to have this, the generation of offspring. Similarly, in a marriage that has been permanently sterilized, or in a marriage that will never have children either by choice or by, as a matter of fact, the organs are not intact. So the point that I'm making is that there's something different to marriage. It's not just this union for a purpose. And I think that, I guess my reflection is I think that's a very male way of looking at the world, and I think maybe that's why it got into the tradition much more quickly than this other part, because you got to make something, got to produce something, and so I think I think women are much more sensitive to the fact of relation, that we are in relation to one another, and that this relation is real, and that in marriage this relationship becomes complete. And it's completed not just in a physical way, but it is completed in a spiritual way, it's completed in a rational way. And I think that's what Thomas Aquinas is getting at when he talks about this union in being. That it is essential, that it is a new essence, that this new being comes into existence. It is the juridical entity in canon law. It ought to be the moral entity in our moral discussions. And so, I think this is, if you plumb the tradition deep enough, you're going to find the wisdom to the vexing questions of the contemporary era. And I think that's where I find one of the answers to homosexuality. Now, there are other answers. I mean, Ruth gave me the sign that said, sit down, your term is over. But, there are other issues that need to be developed. Is it okay for homosexuals to have a union of friendship? Of course it is. But remember, friendship, and Laura talked about pleasure and its proper place. The union of friendship has to be a friendship that is a moral union. It can't simply be a union of utility or a union of pleasure. So there's just a great deal in the tradition to help us with this vexing problem. And I just wanted to unpack a little bit of it coming off the conference last year and coming into the questions today. This notion that these two beings now become this new being, the marriage. The marriage itself is a being. The marriage itself is a being, and that's what makes a difference.
I think we have time for one, maybe two questions if they're kept brief. Did I see one over here?
Yes, I guess my question is a practical one. Both of you have talked about how procreation is the what was the primary part of a marriage, and how it does kind of water down what's going on if there's not at least an option that's available. And this I can see good ground for. But what my question is then, what do you do in practical life when, say, within the marriage, which you are already in, one of the partners is said, I'm not okay with this right now, and then where do you go? Because even though some people might think, I would like to have this as an option, it doesn't seem to me to be an ethical choice to say, well, we're just going to do this. Where I have known, people who have refused to do anything on that.
Right.
Right. What do you do when you're not in agreement? How do you live that way?
Obviously there are different, ends at stake, and the end of the marriage and the unity there is a very important one. So if both couples aren't convinced about this, then, to some extent, the person who has this view about that I've been promoting here, I think will have to accommodate their spouse. Sexually, of course in other ways too. But you keep talking, right? You keep thinking about it, maybe reading and reflecting. Maybe I'm disagreeing with Peg here. I don't know if I am, but I guess I think that this view is maybe it comes somewhat more naturally to women who do care about the relationship and its being fully sort of meaningful and significant, and want to see themselves as not replaceable and so forth. That's kind of important sometimes to women, and maybe men don't always see it as readily, but it can be the other way around because of the fears that have been instilled in us and that are sometimes very real about pregnancy and what's going to do to all kinds of things for women now, right? Career and all of that. I mean, this is just harder question, you might say, culturally as well as personally than they used to be. But yeah, I don't think the answer is that one can just. It would be correct. In other words, I hope I'm speaking in line with the tradition here. But I don't think it would be correct to withhold, say, sexual intercourse from your spouse because they're not going to do it with regard to your own convictions and so forth. I think that you have to still try to build that unity in being, and maybe some of the other things will. Just as maybe you continue, even in times when you're pretty angry at each other and so forth, you still keep working on the unity because you're hoping eventually it'll all come together, right? But we're in a fallen world.
One more brief question. Way in the back.
I gave a friend an argument that was similar to yours in start with the conversation. They had an objection that I hope you might be able to show me how to answer. As I presented the arguments like this, sexual union objectively signifies some sort of total mutual self-gift to the spouse. Second, contraception involves a lack of total mutual self-giving just because it involves rejection of the other's fertility and one's own. So contraception is a lie in fertility. They responded, well then, why not say the abstaining couple is withholding fertility and rejecting the other's fertility? How would you respond to that?
Well, I think the answer is that they might be. I mean, you know, a lot here is in the intentions of what your reason is for refraining from sexual activity, you know, in the times in which you're fertile. It might come out of a very similar contraceptive purpose, right? A withholding really of your fertility that does, in fact, end up coloring, you might say, or being the background for the practice even of natural family planning. So it's not like automatically if you're using some natural method of family planning, you can't possibly have this kind of lack of total gift of self. You still could. But at least in the action itself, the sex act itself doesn't say that, right? It doesn't say, well, I accept you, but not only this far. You know, just make sure that no pregnancy results and so forth. At least those acts are not, as it were, within their very nature, saying something that you don't want to say. So to not say them is different than saying and sort of taking
Sessions
back.
have ended. There will now be a break until 3:15. Thank you.
Please join me in. Thank you. Everybody stay here.
Boy, they're really
Thank you guys
really
very
tough
much.
now with that beep.
I know.
Thanks.